All right, so welcome to our third seminar in our History at seminar series for semester 1, 2025. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting, at least in person here, on the unceded traditional lands of the Pamalong clan of the Wabakal people, and pay respect to their elders past and present. It is my pleasure today to welcome Dr. DowlingSoka. Joe is a freshly minted PhD in ancient history from Macquarie University and conducts research into the militarization of religion, as well as questions of marginalization in the pre-modern world, and in particular the Byzantine/later Roman Empire. Joe currently serves as a casual academic at Macquarie University, as well as our own University of Newcastle, where she has contributed to our ancient history program and has inspired countless future Greek historians in our AHIS 1000 as a tutor. Today, Joe will be talking about her research related to her PhD, in particular, the miracles of 626 CE, religious memorialization in the aftermath of war.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for having me. Today, I'm going to walk you all through some of the material from my recently finished PhD. I'll begin with a narrative contextualizing my research and explaining its historical context. From there, I will turn to the methodology and detail some of the concepts and concerns that underlie the narrative I present today. So without further ado, let us begin with a bit of a story about 2 weeks in 626 CE. According to surviving narratives about the early 7th century, a pair of divine interventions in the summer of 626 changed the course of one of the most destructive wars in Roman history. So at that time, the Vasileiaton Romaion, which we call the Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, had been fighting a war with Āranscar, which we call the Sasanian Empire or Persian Empire, for the last 24 years. The Romans, or Romei, as they called themselves, were losing badly. The war had started in the aftermath of a violent coup in the capital of Kōnstantinoupolis 24 years earlier, in the year 602. That year, a Romei army mutinied. The mutineers, led by a soldier named Phocas, marched on Constantinople. They murdered the Basileus Romaion, that's the Roman emperor, Marikios, along with his entire family. However, Marikios' son, Theodōsios, was rumored to have escaped the massacre and to have sought refuge with the ruler of Iran. The mutineers installed Phocas as the new Basileus. In the aftermath of this violent regime change, the Shahan-Shah-i-Iran, or the ruler of rulers of the Iranians, Khusro Parviz, invaded Roman territory with the explicit goal of restoring Theodosius' Roman ruler. The war that followed over the next 26 years, concluding in 628, devastated the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans, displaced populations, destroyed urban environments throughout the region, and disrupted trade throughout the entire Mediterranean. It also almost completely ended the Roman Empire. By 615, Khusro Parviz gave up on trying to install a puppet ruler and shifted the campaign into an attempt to totally conquer the Romans. This shift in the Shah's goals was enabled by a Romei civil war. In 608, the family of Hērakleios the Elder, who was one of Marikios' generals and the military governor of Africa, launched a revolution. After 2 years of civil war, the Romei revolutionaries sailed on Constantinopolis in 610. They murdered Phocas and made Hērakleios' son, also named Hērakleios, the new Roman ruler. My apologies about Roman naming practices. We have way too many Hēraklei and even more Theodori in the early 7th century, so I'm afraid it does sometimes get confusing. This civil war led to a total collapse of Romei defenses against a pair of invading armies. When Hērakleios attempted to sue for peace in the face of these assaults, Khusro imprisoned Hērakleios' messengers and escalated the war. What had been a border war became a full invasion. By the end of the decade, an army led by a general named Sharvaraz had conquered Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, while an army, the texts say, was led by a general named Shahin, dealt a series of defeats to Roman defenses in Anatolia, so modern-day Turkey, and had even penetrated to Chalkidon, a city just across a narrow strait from the Roman capital of Constantinopolis. At the same time, perhaps capitalizing on the unrest, the Avar Khaganate and the Balkans decided to start a new war against the Romans. The Avar Khaganate was a multi-ethnic state ruled by the Avars, a group that had arrived in the 6th century from the Eurasian steppes and who had settled in the Carpathian Basin after the Romans paid them to conquer the other groups living in the area. The Romans and Avars had then been at war sporadically in earlier decades, but Phocas had made a peace treaty with them. So after Phocas died, the Avar Khagan quit respecting the treaty. The Romans were no longer offering him enough money, and they had repeatedly been defeated. So instead, he marshaled his subjects, a wide variety of different ethnic groups, many of whom were not serving him by choice, into a series of attacks on the Roman capital in the 620s. As a result, by the early 620s, the Romans were facing a war for survival on 2 fronts. In response, the Basileus Hērakleios abandoned the capital to its own defenses, trained a new mobile force, which he personally led on a series of hidden maneuvers in northern Asia Minor and Armenia. This slowed down but did not stop the collapse of the Eastern Roman frontier. By mid-626, Hērakleios was facing an army led by Shahin in eastern Anatolia. He had been chased around by this army for several years, while Sharvaraz's army was camped just across the Bosporus from Constantinople. Only the Roman navy presented Persians attacking the city, and at the same time, the Avar Khaganate coalition of diverse groups that the Romans had treated poorly in the past launched a serious attempt to take the city of Constantinople. In Constantinople, the adolescent son of the Basileus, Hērakleios Konstantinos, who was under the supervision of Bonos, one of Hērakleios' generals, faced the Khagan and Sharvaraz as they attempted to take the capital. The Avars pressed their attacks for 10 days, attempting a naval incursion and direct assaults against the walls. So on this map, which is, don't pay too much attention to it because it's got more on it than it needs to, you can see the line of siege towers. Those are based on the source for this battle. And then the Avars are attacking down from that bridge of Kallinikos on the very top of the map, going down the bay. After 9 days of failed assaults, the Khaganate's Slavic allies attempted a naval invasion with massive boats that were carved from single logs. They were aimed to pass the Blachernae Quarter, which is a home to a major church to Maria, the Parthenos Theometor, the Virgin Mother of God, and to invade the harbor side of the city, while the main Avar attack targeted the land walls. A fleet of 25-meter-long Roman warships ambushed this amphibious attack, destroying it utterly. This is a technologically one-sided battle, as the contrast between the pictures I have up on the screen should probably highlight. It doesn't need a miracle to explain, but they imagined it in miraculous terms. So seeing the destruction, the Avars give up their assault, they burn their own siege towers and retreat. Sharvaraz also retreats, the city is saved. Meanwhile, in Pontos, that's now northeastern Turkey, Shahin's army had taken Efhaita, a relatively small town most notable as the hometown of and pilgrimage destination for the cult of a soldier and martyr named Theodōros. This army wrecked much of the town and burnt the church of the saint, disturbing his relics. Meanwhile, they were harassed by 2 Roman forces. Hērakleios had split his army into 3, with one contingent defending the capital and 2 others staying east. One of these was led by Hērakleios himself, and the other by his brother Theodōros. One of these Roman detachments raided Shahin's army as it was occupying Efhaita. Shahin's army marched east, perhaps in pursuit, where they were ambushed by the second army in the mountains. As Shahin's army regrouped from the second attack, an unexpected hailstorm broke out, devastating the army as it crossed a river. This allowed the Roman army led by Theodōros to win a total victory that was the end of Shahin, a general who had represented the primary threat to the Romans for the last 15 years. These victories transformed an existential war from a long grinding defeat for the Romans into a stalemate. After Shahin was defeated, Hērakleios took his part of the army on a personally led counteroffensive into Mesopotamia. Now, the last time a Roman ruler had tried such a thing had been centuries before, in the reign of the last non-Christian emperor. That ruler, Julianos, anglicized as Julian the Apostate, died on his campaign. His ambition ended in disaster and a new dynasty. Unlike his unfortunate predecessor, Hērakleios eventually does return home, but for a period of 2 years after the turning point in the war, it was an open question whether the Vasilevs would ever return to the palace. During this period, in the middle of 627, Bonos, the general who had won the battle against the Avar and Slavic forces and who had led the government in Hērakleios' absence, died. The absence of the ruler, the young age of his heir, and the death of his chosen regent created a moment of opportunity, which supporters of a man named Geōrgios seized. Geōrgios was the leader of the Kōnstantinoupolitan church, and according to his followers, the entirety of Christianity. Either he or his followers wished that position to be closer to a theocracy. So they attempted to rewrite and memorialize the battle in a way that made this retrospectively true. The Sergian milieu, a group of authors patronized by the patriarch, wrote texts transforming the battles that occurred from feats of human planning, technology, or timing into divine interventions in which it was the repentant piety of the people of the empire, led by the hierarch and patriarch Geōrgios, that allowed for a series of divine interventions. Two writers, both directly in the employ of Geōrgios, wrote narratives of the siege between the victories in the summer of 626 and Hērakleios' return in 628. The poet and church official, Geōrgios Pisidēs, and the church official, Theodōros Synkellos, memorialized the battle in a manner that made Bonos and Hērakleios' preparations unimportant and gave the decisive victory to the direct intervention of the Parthenos Maria, the Virgin Mary. In both narratives, Maria had been moved by the prayers of her city, especially those of Geōrgios, and took personal action, bodily joining the fight as it raged around her house. The Parthenos capsized an entire navy and saved the city. These religious narratives minimized the work of the human defenders and the crews of the Roman navy in favor of presenting a story in which piety had direct military value. Both texts stress that the active agent was Maria, never called by name, but by a variety of titles. She's the Parthenos, that is virgin, the Theometer, the mother of God, the Tekusa Asperos, she who gave birth without seed, and the Theotokos, the bearer of God. In the opening of his poem, Geōrgios declares that if one of the portrait artists wishes to exhibit the battle's trophies, let them place in front the one who birthed without seed, and let them depict her portrait. He stresses her unique immutability, both in battle and in birth. These are themes that run throughout the whole poem. In Theodōros' sermon, the battle is a deed done by the Lord of forces through the bearer of God, and he declares that the Virgin alone won this conquest and conquered this victory. The sermon is filled with prayer after prayer to the Theotokos. In their narrative of the battle itself, this prayer is answered. Maria intervenes bodily, actively taking part in the battle. As Geōrgios writes it in his poem, I think the virginal parent alone stretched the bows and struck the shield, even becoming embroiled in the unclear interweaving, to hit, to wound, to reflect the sword, both to turn back and cover over the skiffs, and to grant to all a deep abode, for it is nothing strange if the Virgin defends. This is a very clear message that she is the only savior of this city and that she actively, personally took part. After the battle, this idea was also inscribed into the landscape of the church most closely associated with the victory. Sometime after the siege, Geōrgios wrote an epigram for the church of Theotokos at Blackerne. It reads, if you seek a terrifying throne of God on earth, behold, marvel at the house of the Parthenos, for she, bearing God with her arms, carries him into the worship of this place. Here, those having been ordained to rule the earth have faith that they hold the scepter of victory. Here, many universal misfortunes, the patriarch keeping vigil averts, and the barbarians having surrounded the city, as they saw that she not alone commanded, they bent straightway their unbending knees. So this glorification of the Virgin as the sole victor who guarantees the social order was then visible for centuries after the battle. Simultaneously, the authors positioned Geōrgios to be both a spiritual defender and a military one, effectively preempting any divide between church power and military power. A vivid example of how this worked can be seen in the work of the poet Geōrgios Pisidēs, who outright merged Maria and Geōrgios into one figure. Parts of the poem are an ode to both of them simultaneously. For example, and this is one of my favorite pieces of this poem. So for this one, I'll read it in Greek so you can hear the poetry and then translate it into English. Stratege ton enoplon dakrion, ton pyrpolundon, ton thrasos, ton barbaron, hosos gar aplois, tas roas, ton omaton, tosuton erges tas roas, ton ematon. Hail, general of the armored tiers, assailing with fire the barbarian boldness. The more you open the streams of your eyes, the more you contain the streams of our blood. This addresses Geōrgios and Maria simultaneously, merging them into one victor. It uses the rhetoric of hymns, echoing hymns to Maria that were sung in the city on religious occasions. The language is vividly poetic, connecting crying in prayer to God with salvation. For salvation, with staunching the bleeding of the people of the city. The assailing with fire verb is a word that had been used in Greek before, both for the effects of siege weapons and for the effects of pious tears. So the connection allows for a pair of decidedly unmilitarized figures to become a single war leader together. This matches material evidence from the city. A set of lead seals from the early 7th century show images of Maria on one side with the image of Geōrgios on the other. So what we have here is a multimodal propaganda campaign designed to turn Geōrgios into a militarily effective leader despite his non-military role in the church. In the specific context of the unstable environment of Kōnstantinoupolis in 626, the decision to prioritize Maria as the savior of the city rather than Bonos, was deeply political. It built on a prior set of church messaging written during the earlier years of the war, in which Theodōros and Geōrgios both cast Hērakleios as a pious king who listened to the words and advice of Geōrgios. In the aftermath of 626, the effective ruler was Hērakleios Kōnstantinos, the underage son of Hērakleios. Theodōros and Geōrgios took this opportunity of a seemingly weak ruler in a time of military crisis to bolster Geōrgios and present him as a fatherly figure overseeing the affairs of the underage emperor. At the same time, they made no mention of the wide variety of officials and Heraclean dynasty family members who were also parts of the power structure. The effect was to create a new narrative modeled on the Greek Old Testament, in which a powerful prophet and high priest became the patron and protector of the young and pious ruler. They used the moment of crisis to do this. By casting Maria as a war hero rather than Bonos, the religious victory became the one that mattered. Part of their attempt to bolster Geōrgios was the erasure of the roles of any other figure except for Geōrgios, Hērakleios Kōnstantinos, and Bonos. The civic officials, military leaders, and others who made up the power structure in Constantinople are entirely absent in the texts written in this period. Hērakleios' other children are mentioned briefly, but their mother, Martina, who later sources cast as a powerful, overbearing figure who tries to rule the empire in her own right, is entirely missing. The simplification of a political dynamic bolstered Geōrgios and cast Hērakleios Kōnstantinos as Geōrgios' ward under his protection, and Theodōros actively compares him to specifically Solomon. So figures such as Theodōros, who's Hērakleios' brother, who had won probably the most decisive battle in the war and returned to Constantinopolis in the aftermath of the siege, he's absent. The erasures created an imagined past in which Geōrgios, through the power of Maria, guaranteed the safety and reign of the young emperor, while the elder Hērakleios looked on from afar and also prayed to Maria for salvation. The end of the war in 628 and the return of the vassalettes in 630 changed the political dynamic. Geōrgios' moment of opportunity closed. The long-awaited coming of age and marriage of the young Hērakleios Kōnstantinos became a relatively minor footnote in the triumphal narrative of Hērakleios' war. In the context of the returned ruler and a triumph, Geōrgios fell into the background, despite still being the primary patron of the arts. In that moment of monarchical restoration, the memorialization of the siege changed. The human factor returned. We start getting detailed narratives of what Hērakleios' chosen general, Bonos, did to win the actual battle. The texts maintain Maria's divine intervention, but they break any close connection between her and Geōrgios. Instead, the imagery shifts to a triumphant, restored Christian monarchy and to glorifying the emperor. In Geōrgios' later poetry and in a mixed prose and poetry narrative account of the war, the Theotokos is associated with Hērakleios first and foremost. After the war ended, then, Geōrgios, who is still at this point working directly for Sergios, tells stories of a new version of the beginning of Hērakleios' reign, in which he came into Kōnstantinoupolis with icons of Maria attached to his ships. This symbolism takes an image that had belonged to Sergios for most of the 620s and reimagines it as a symbol for the entire reign of Hērakleios. But again, all evidence suggests that Geōrgios worked for Sergios. So rather than seeing Geōrgios as a poet serving multiple agendas and multiple patrons, it might be instead that Sergios ordered his subordinates to cede these symbols to the returned ruler. In this scenario, when Sergios is faced with the return of Hērakleios, he abandons the more ambitious attempts to increase church power in favor of supporting the regime. And when Hērakleios dies, the situation changes again. The final text associated with Sergios' successor, Pyrrhos, presents a dramatically more negative picture of Hērakleios while also abandoning the narrative of divine intervention in favor of one in which Hērakleios' clever underlings make up for the moral failings of the ruler. So we're in a very fluid dynamic where the war is being memorialized several different ways based on the political context. The battle in Xanthos had a similar reception in the post-return literature. In an account that survives in fragments in a later chronicle written sometime after the war, Hērakleios' brother Theodōros is the beneficiary of a second Marian intervention. The fragments of that account have no local detail, though they do credit Theodōros with leading the army. The credit is undercut, however, by the text recording the decisive hailstorm and Theodōros' destruction of Shahin's army, which this text credits it as a first miracle of the Theotokos. Theodōros is present, but Maria won this battle too. The author of the text is likely also Geōrgios, continuing the pattern of eliminating effective human agency in favor of divine intervention of a very specific religious figure. But at this point, after the end of the war, the beneficiary of the memorialization of a divine intervention had changed from Sergios to the returned Hērakleios. Theodōros, having led the army that won what was probably the most decisive battle in the war, made the dynasty appear more powerful. But it also introduces the threat of usurpation from within the dynasty. So by making Maria a figure that tips the balance in favor of victory, Geōrgios insulates the dynasty from the destabilizing effects of having a member who was not the ruler or his heir win a battle. The same people who had been responsible for bolstering the power of the church 2 years earlier used the powerful spiritual imagery they had created again to support the monarchy. This contrasts, by the way, with a local tradition where it is Theodōros the recruit, the local martyr of Epheida, who actually sends the hailstorm and ends the war. The rewrites of the events of the siege and the symbols associated to make a narrative of a resurgent monarchy became the first of many reuses of the story of the siege for other newer purposes, as the legend of the siege and divine intervention associated with it developed over the centuries that followed. Now, what I've just given you is an overview of the miracles associated with 2 weeks in 626 and a fast track through a 28-year war that was the center of my project, is just one way to make sense of a messy cluster of source material. And unpacking that narrative, I just spent, 20 minutes delivering, took another 80,000 words or so. And also involved around 11,000 words of Greek translation. So, in the rest of my time with you all today, I want to talk through some of the more generalizable methodological issues that came up in the course of the project, as I attempted to first identify and then make sense of a complex set of untranslated into English texts written in Greek in the early 7th century. So, in its final form, the project centered upon the research question: how did the Roman authors of the Sergian Milo in Kōnstantinoupolis in 628 respond to the military crises as evidenced by occasional literature produced after the siege but before the end of the war? Now, that has a lot of jargon in it and needs some unpacking. And there were quite a few sub-questions. Some of those we've touched on, but I would like to spend some time talking about the processes and theoretical underpinnings that led to this particular question. So when I started approaching the case study of the militarization of Maria in 626, all I really had to go on was the knowledge that there were a couple of texts associated with the siege that transform her into a war hero. At that time, the project was conceived as a multi-sided study looking at a wide number of different examples of militarization. Maria being militarized rather than the usual set of men was intriguing, and I started working through the texts and contexts. At that time, I attempted to use social network theory to illustrate the connections between the texts. I quickly found that a model which just used links between individual people was not sufficient to capture the complexity of the text's authors and the shifting political landscape. And so I attempted to deal with this by adding the texts themselves to the network and showing intertextual links that referenced each other and links between the texts and the people and so on. In retrospect, I probably shouldn't have been surprised when this sort of analysis collapsed very quickly under its own weight. But it did highlight a rich set of texts specifically associated with the figure of Hērakleios, patriarch. The social network was a really useful exercise in focusing my project and highlighting relationships between texts, authors, and places, but it was not effective in providing a communicatable articulation of those connections. I'm not the first person using social network theory to run into this problem. Recently, Oscar Dominguez, when working on a similar set of patriarchal patronage networks, also found that the social network model proved too rigid for his material. So instead, he used the concept of a milieu, that is the social environment surrounding a text or author, as a way of articulating the complex systems of patronage in the Middle Byzantine period. I ran with this concept, and the center of my study became the Circean milieu. The surviving evidence for this consists of 6 authors who, one way or another, were connected with the figure of Hērakleios. These authors were in some cases quite prolific, but there are only a handful of them. There's one author of poetry, one author of sermons, one author of both history and philosophy. Unless a great deal has been lost without any trace at all, what we have is a dynamic in which the church was keeping up appearance of Roman literary traditions, but in an extremely limited fashion compared to the literary circles that existed before and after the 7th century. Now, the vast majority of these texts fall under the category of occasional literature, which I found a very useful concept. Occasional literature refers to compositions for specific events and times. This is usually used to talk about poetry, but the key for a piece being occasional is that there's a specific event in mind that causes it to be composed. In Byzantine studies, occasional literature is mostly discussed in academic studies of the 12th century, where our documentation of events and texts associated with them is quite strong. For example, Ingela Nilsson's work focuses on the author Kōnstantinoupolis Manasses, reading his corpus as occasional literature. She argues that occasional literature does not require the author to subsume their own voice, but rather that for writers who need to establish themselves as writers to gain more commissions, a clearly recognizable voice is crucial. Her approach suggests that the author's literary persona becomes a brand of source, which allows them to distinguish themselves from other authors and demonstrate why they should be chosen over others to commemorate an occasion. At the same time, the author takes on an unreliable literary persona that suits the occasion, which is often lost to us, and the literary imaginary that goes with it. In Nilsson's conception, the voice in occasional literature offers evidence of a composer's shifting persona and their imagined worldview that is in reference to the occasion being represented. This view of authorial voice that is distinct and characteristic, even if it takes on different positions as regards politics, social strata, or gender, is important for thinking about the small stable of authors that remained active despite the pressures of the Persian War. Geōrgios Pisidēs created a distinct brand of poetry and has a corpus of literature that is almost entirely linked to commemoration events. Theodōros Synkellos wrote 2 sermons, again about specific events associated with the city, and has a distinct style and set of rhetoric in both. Theophylact Simokatis becomes the only author of classicizing history or philosophy, taking 2 older genres and making them his own, while crediting Hērakleios, his patron, with enabling both. The performative effects of individual styles are job security for authors who were patronized by a single powerful figure. Thinking about how the texts that survive fit the occasions for literature raises a variety of often unanswerable questions about who was paying the author, how well they were situated in the political landscape, and what specific occasions are connected to which literary output. While the texts that respond to 626 come from a wide variety of literary genres, they are all subject to the constraints of being occasional literature. It becomes a supergenre of sorts, which requires that the authors also pay attention to the constraints of the specific genre they're writing in, but while still paying attention to Geōrgios' their patron's needs. And while the specific methods used in each text become quite different, they often show considerable overlap in the performative effects that they have on readers. And they also reference each other. So when you have two texts referring to the same event, there will be internal references between them, even though they're coming from separate genres. Understanding these as performative texts produced for specific occasions became key to understanding how each text functioned. Theories on how people create and use memorialization are also significant when analyzing occasional literature, as such texts are often composed to play a role in shaping collective memory. The texts themselves become creations that both respond to real events and reenact and shape the memory for the purpose of reinscribing or resisting power relations. Jan Asman writes of a relationship between power and memory, in which the act of remembering something beyond the period of communicative memory, which he defines as roughly 80 to 100 years, with a progressive present spanning 3 to 4 generations, is connected to acts of power in which rulers attempt to force their stories to be remembered and for other stories to be forgotten. At the same time, these oppressions also create resistance, which in turn causes some stories to be remembered as a way of denying the oppressive authority that would prefer they be forgotten. The texts responding to 626 are all examples of the former, where it is a powerful ruler imposing memorialization. In addition, because occasions like military threat, defeat, and victory often serve as moments for memorialization, attempts to construct memories of the past, both in art and culture, are significant in terms of understanding the militarization of culture. This project drew upon Asman's work in understanding the material that survives as the product of a process of construction and representation that is guided by particular motives, expectations, hopes, and aims, each of which takes its form from the referential frame of the present. The memorialization of events are fundamentally changes in collective memory rather than direct tellings of the real events. The actual experience of the battle, involving tens of thousands of individual points of view, is simply too big for there to be a single memory of the event. As such, for there to be a standard memory of the meaning of something so large requires that there's an active process that simplifies the reality of what happened into something understandable. This memorialization can be done through a wide variety of means and often involves inscribing the memory onto the landscape itself, changing the meaning of the very terrain to be about the event being memorialized, as we saw with the church in Blackernai. One effect of memorialization is also the erasure of other experiences of the past. In 1995, Michel Roth-Trujillo's Silencing the Past used examples from Haitian history demonstrate that silence was an active process rather than a merely passive one. As he put it, the presences and absences embodied in sources, artifacts and bodies that turn an event into a fact, or archives, which are facts collected, thematized, and processed as documents and monuments, are neither neutral or natural, they are created. His approach identifies 3 moments where silences enter historical production. The first is an initial act of writing stories down. If no one records an event, historians have no ability to access that event. The second is the collation of material into archives or collections where they can be found again. If an object or book is not archived, it's not likely to survive. And if it does survive in a place where no one can find it, it cannot be used to write history. And third, historians have to decide to value the source when they find it. It is entirely possible for a source to survive, be easily discoverable, and then be entirely ignored, thanks to the concerns of individuals writing history. I found this concept vital when thinking about the limited perspective of the historical documentation might have changed the overall narrative, as it was a reminder to keep in mind the scale of silence. It was also a reminder that all of our texts are coming from a single historical archive. I also attempted, and this is with much less success, to apply critical fabulation to the massive silences of 626. Saidia Hartman's 2008 article, Venus in Two Acts, introduced this concept. Her process involved advancing a series of speculative arguments and exploiting the capacities of the subjunctive to fashion a narrative, which is based upon archival research. These narratives allow her to tell an impossible story and to amplify the impossibility of its retelling. Rather than recovering the lives of the enslaved or redeeming the dead, Hartman's method aims to paint as full a picture of the lives of captives, which become a double gesture of straining against the limits of the archive to write cultural history of the captive, and at the same time enacting the impossibility of representing the lives of captives precisely through the process of narration. It attempts to throw into crisis what happened when, as well as exploit the transparency of sources as fictions of history. Now, I don't really, in my project, I attempted to use narratives similar to the one I started with to accomplish a similar goal. And I must say, I don't think I succeeded here. The clearest example of this is that I do not believe I successfully centered the disenfranchised. And my attempts to do so, there were several early on in the project. They ended up, the only thing I had access to sort-wise was the vividness of their deaths. And it felt like it backfired rather than supporting the disenfranchised of the past. So instead, the best I managed is to attempt to draw attention to the limitation of these texts for talking about the rest of the people who survived the siege. I found myself trapped by the Sergian milieu, even in my attempts to use populist media such as hymns. I feel like all I truly managed was to highlight just how silent everyone except Geōrgios' followers ended up being. As I revisit this project and decide where to take it, I think it may be important to find ways to expand the perspective and paint a fuller picture of the hundreds of thousands of mostly oppressed people involved in the catastrophe that Geōrgios and Theodōros memorialized. Okay. The final issue I want to discuss are some questions around the ethics of representation that came up during the course of this project, both in general terms of any representation of the Eastern Roman past and in more specific issues of the militarizations upon which my project centered. On the larger issue, you may have noticed that I used rather a lot of Greek and Persian names and titles in the narrative with which I open this presentation. This is something of a departure from the norms of my field. Currently, the standard naming practices in the fields of late antiquity and Byzantine history are rather contested. There's several stances right now, and they're yelling at each other. But the most common practice in the 20th century was to anglicize at least some of the names involved, generally the biblical ones and the more important figures, and to use either Latin or English terminology when describing most of the offices and titles. So Theodore rather than Theodōros, George rather than Geōrgios, Mary rather than Maria, king or emperor rather than Basileus, Byzantine rather than Romaei. This is especially true with terms that are connected to the Greek New Testament, such as John rather than Yanni. So, to my mind, this represents a centuries-old appropriation of the Hellenistic world into Anglophone culture. And on a personal note, living in Kingsgrove, a suburb that's more than 20% Greek, and which has many Greek first language speakers, really highlighted to me the reality that the culture I was studying was still important to people who are living in Australia today. A remarkable illustration of this, which ties directly into the project, is this icon, which I first saw in a shop window in Earlwood, one of the most Greek neighborhoods in Australia. It is an icon of one of my primary sources, a liturgical hymn written after the battle. It depicts Maria in full armor, with Christ embossed on plate mail, standing with a sword bearing the words of the hymn in front of the specific church she defended in the miracle towns I studied. And as I discovered while I was on Kefalonia writing the final stages of this project, this hymn is still extremely well known. When people heard about my project there, they seemed almost compelled to tell me the story of how Maria saved them personally. And while this is a fascinating reception of my primary source, and I have many thoughts about it, I think the experience really brought home the realization that there are ethical issues when working with events from 1300 years ago. And I think it is compounded by anglicizing names and creating neologistic titles for these past empires. I think it risks distancing them from modern cultures that still today identify with these stories. The other issue I would want to raise when it comes to naming practices is that of ongoing discrimination. An employment study from 2022 qualitatively demonstrated that ethnic names were actively discriminated against in the job market. Yanni is significantly less likely to get a job than John. This results in widespread Anglification of non-English names because people need jobs. I don't want to be a part of this problem. While at the same time, I also don't want to impose modern ethnicity creation onto the past. I think there's a danger of falling into orthodox always was, always will be Greek fascist stuff. And I want to avoid that. So what I came to as a compromise was using spellings of names and titles transliterated directly from the texts from the 7th century. It's imperfect. I'm not completely happy with the results, but I think it's important to consider how our work relates to issues of modern oppression and, when possible, work to find ways to mitigate those issues. And these issues are not limited to nomenclature or only to the Greek world. From my positionality as a trans woman and immigrant from America, I think the current global climate makes representations of ethnic supremacist ideologies and studying and autocratic regimes of the past particularly fraught. And I'm very interested in strategies of harm mitigation when writing about past autocracies. And just to conclude with an example of where this is modern, affecting things in the modern world, the religious memorialisation and militarization that occurred in 626 has not gone away. It exists in modern Greece, and it also exists in Ukraine. In the course of the war there, Marian militarization has continued. And on Easter 2022, Zelensky gave an address from Hagia Sophia in Kiev, where he thanked the Orontes, which is an 11th century icon copied from the icon of the Church of Lacernae, which is the icon associated with this battle. And he credited the Orontes with the Ukrainian victory in the recently concluded Battle of Kiev. So you have a Jewish president thanking an 11th century icon based on a 7th century Greek icon for victory in a modern battle. The powerful image of Maria that Geōrgios created to bolster Geōrgios long outlasted its initial composition and became instead something that's part of a living and popular tradition. It gained a life of its own that has become meaningful to a wider variety of people than I think Geōrgios and Theodōros could have ever imagined. Thank you all for listening.
Yes, thank you very much, Joe, for a very wide-reaching talk that brought in the narrative, also demonstrating to the students in the room the use of interdisciplinary studies. I was really impressed of your use of Haitian history to inform your study of Byzantine history or Roman history. And yeah, very good. I'll stop rambling on about that and open it up to questions.
So firstly, I want to echo what Ryan has said. And I particularly appreciate that what you did is you drew back the veil and you showed some of the false starts, of really promising theoretical approaches that actually didn't pay out. And I think that I wish we could make more HDR students aware that sometimes you'll have this great idea and maybe sometime down the track you'll get a paper out of it or something, but it's just not going to pan out. So that was absolutely fascinating. The whole thing was really, really interesting. I guess the question I'm most curious about is, why do you have this contraction of Roman literature in this period?
Yes, and so I think there's several pieces happening here. One is you're on the second autocratic coup in 20 years. So the patronage networks, a lot of people were purged, and a lot of the people purged were the old aristocrats.
Right. Okay.
So what's left of the patronage network? It's very hard to say who exactly is the reason it's gone. All the sources we have blame Phocas, but all the sources we have were written during the reign of the person who killed Phocas. So what we have there is in some ways it's a total, I almost think of the Hērakleian era of Rome as a new government, new structure, I think we have this image of Rome as this undying thing that just keeps going. And I see it more as a series of different governments calling themselves Roman. And this is one of the new ones.
So reinvention, so to speak.
And then Sergios seems to have come in and used this. And this is the first time we start seeing like strong rhetoric that that the patriarch is the leader of the entire Christian church, that the emperor should listen to the patriarch. This is stuff that once we get into the papal schisms becomes normal. Photius loves rhetoric like this, but we're seeing it as early as the 600s. And so he has an incentive to have all these authors working for him.
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead. You have to go pretty soon, so go ahead.
Firstly, thank you so much for your talk. It was so interesting. I have a really specific question because it fascinates me a lot. So I was so obsessed with that earlier image of Maria in the militaristic clothes. Oh, that is amazing. And then I was wondering if I could please ask you to jump to the final image. Yes, I cannot see very well, but in that image there, the icon type one, is that militaristic dress again, or is it not? Okay.
No, the militaristic dress is a very new icon, and it's an icon of Ti hypermakos stratiko nikiteria, which is a hymn. And it's the prologue written to something called the Akathistos, which is a big Orthodox hymn sung before Easter.
Okay.
That's hailing Mary.
Cool.
I actually had this hymn sung to me in Kefalonia after I gave this a similar version, not quite as theoretical, but like a presentation on this. Like it's still this very resonant hymn, and then that icon is of this hymn.
Amazing.
And it's the icon is the hypermakos stratiko, the champion general.
Wow. God,
And that's I haven't been able to find that pre-20th century.
Yeah.
I don't. I'm sure it must exist at some point before then, but I've not seen it. And it's so like I just stopped cold. I was walking down the street in Earlwood and just went, oh.
Yeah. Wow. So that, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's not a very common form of representation. That's like really contextualized.
It's super contextualized. It is, and it's an icon of a hymn as much as it's an icon of Mary.
Yeah. Wow. So amazing. Thank you. Sorry, I have to go because I have a class to get to, but thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
So I might go ahead and step in and ask some questions and provide some observation. So it's interesting that that particular hymn is still sung at every Matin service, you know, across not just the Greek world, but in Russian Orthodox tradition, Serbian tradition. So it's still very much, even outside of the context of the Akathistos hymn, it's still.
Yeah, it's been separated from the Akathistos. So the Akathistos is this huge thing done on Friday, the week before Easter. And then the hypermakos stratiko has been turned into a kontakion.
Yes, yeah.
In its own right, and it's divorced from its original context. But this was written, we're pretty sure specifically, like the Akathistos was rewritten by Geōrgios Pisidēs, and this bit was written, it was added to it after the siege. I do have a recording if you wanted to hear it,
But more also, so I did have a couple of questions. First of all, you know, I don't like your talk because it challenges some of the things I've been arguing, so.
No.
But no. But that's okay. I'm curious, you think, you know, this, return of Hērakleios, the fact that he survives, you know, obviously Sergios survives, you know, for quite several years and becomes the sort of architect of Hērakleios's religious policy.
yeah.
But there does seem to be, you know, some pronounced tension. Do you think that, you know, Hērakleios is aware of what has been going on in his absence and he's trying to, you know?
And I don't know. I don't know. Like the 630s seem like they're like what I can say is that that's the people working for Sergios start giving up the Marian rhetoric and giving it to Hērakleios. But like Hērakleios certainly jumps full throttle into Sergios's religious policy, which we start seeing in this. Monothelete shows up as one of the adjectives used by will alone, and it's the name of a doctrine that comes in the 30s after Hērakleios' return, and he uses that to describe Mary's intervention. If I'm remembering correctly, it's something like that.
But you do seem to have this tension where, Hērakleios will issue, the ekthesis, and then Sergios feels the need to issue the Cephos to sort of convert, right? Like there's there's a almost autocratic sense that the emperor has authority over religion, but Sergius is trying to push against that. Also, the reason that we attribute, going back to Theophylax and Mikado, which wasn't the center of your talk, but you did reference him and his patronage, or Sergius's patronage. He never mentions his patron. He just refers to interesting metaphors, including, that you restored history. You're the great hierophant and archpriest.
Yeah.
But also you're the new Hērakleios. And I've been. I want to get your thought on this. I've used that as a sense to say, actually, this is a nascent understanding of the priesthood of the emperor, but it could equal, assuming you're right, it could almost be saying, oh, you're the true Hērakleios rather than Hērakleios.
I'm also not sure there's not a seam in what he's saying right there. I think the Hērakleian stuff he does praise the Hērakleian, and then I think he changes. And we need to open the Greek up and look at this together.
Yeah.
But I think this is in the dialogue between history and philosophy at the beginning of the text, and he introduces the Hērakleians as the restorers, and then there's another paragraph where history says, "I am restored by the Hierophant," and I don't think they're referring. I think it's praising both, but the Hierophant I read as Synkellos. And I could be wrong. Like this is a place where
Well, I mean, there's you're just opening new areas of inquiry that I'm really curious about, because George of Pisidēs also uses the same Hērakleian metaphor. The descent into Hades, rescuing Alcestis, he rescues the empire, and it could be maybe there's
some strange things where Hērakleios is made into Perseus. But in your thing, but the thing about making someone into Perseus in the 7th century is that the Christianized version of the myth is actually that Perseus was the first Persian and was a horrible user of black magic. So saying Hērakleios, unlike Perseus with the Gorgone, has Maria and the icon it's praise, but it's a little bit strange.
There's a lot of pushed metaphors to make Hērakleios the hero, a new classical hero as well as a biblical hero, and perhaps not thinking things all over.
And Geōrgios tends to go for a classical, where and there's some Geōrgios gets compared positively to Odysseus several times. Like he uses the classical, whereas Theodōros uses the biblical metaphors.
Very interesting stuff. And then just one last question around the sort of, I guess, supremacy of Constantinople. How does that jive with Sergius's need to consult Rome to sort of intervene in the monopoly or monoenergist and then monopoly controversies?
Well, I think there's a very real reality of the political landscape of the Mediterranean and it's actually Theophylact that says he's the leader of the whole Christian church. That's in the Theophylactus.
But that's if you accept that that's addressed to Sergius. If he's talking to Hērakleios as the true prelate.
It changes things if he's trying to Hērakleios.
Interesting. I'm not trying to. I'm not.
I'm moderate. I did listen to your talk at Leeds and go, "Ooh, did I make a mistake there?" And then went back and was like,
"Well, I did this. I had the same thought with this. Oh, did I make a mistake here?"
But I think there's a change of addressee in that philosophy talks about Hērakleios and history, or vice versa, talks about Synkellos. But and that's so. It would be saying something different if he's addressing Hērakleios and saying you're the leader of the whole Christian church. That's in some ways an even bigger statement.
That's why it's so bold. That's why it's so fascinating to me.
But
we see, at the end of the century, Constans being called emperor and priest.
But to answer your question on the political landscape, and I think he's trying to pretend it doesn't exist, because when we read the